This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking with science fiction writer Jason Sanford, and that interview will begin in a moment. This is Dan Schneider, and before you see Jason Sanford, you may recognize Jason. He did a show earlier this year on the comic book and uh, uh, novel, graphic novel, Watchmen. This time I will be talking with Jason about his writing career in science fiction and out. But first, Jason, if you could just tell some of the viewers a little bit about yourself and your background and how you became a writer and what drew you to science fiction in particular.
Sure. Again, name's Jason Sanford. Born and raised in Alabama. I served in the Peace Corps over in Thailand for a couple of years. Uh, I've worked as a newspaper writer and other communications jobs. But for my writing, I've written stories for a long time. Grew up on science fiction and fantasy. Um, Eventually realized that that's what I wanted to write. I find the genre fascinating for what you can explore and limitless possibilities of the stories. My stories have been published in a number of top science fiction magazines. Asimov's Science Fiction, Interzone, British magazines published, I think, 13 or 14 of my stories. I had a short story collection come out a couple of years ago. Was finalist for the Nebula Award for Best Novella. Have won the Interzone Readers Poll a couple of times. So mainly short fiction has been my focus until now. I am working on some novels, so we'll see how that goes.
Well, you're a few years younger than me, so you're now probably in your mid 40s. So you probably grew up reading some of the same science fiction things that I would have read. I
Right.
remember in the 1960s, the early 70s, there were the Doc Savage novels by Bantam Books. Did you read any of those? The Man of Bronze? They were reprints from 30s and 40s stories. They were very popular in the 60s and 70s in the paperbacks.
No, I do remember my grandfather had a very large science fiction collection, and that's where I was first exposed to science fiction and fantasy. He did have a number of the Doc Savage novels. They never really resonated with me by that point. I did try some of them, but that wasn't. I grew up reading Asimov, Clarke, Ursula Le Guin, many others, Harlan Ellison. He had a large number of classic science fiction magazines, so I did read a lot of the classic science fiction short stories from the late 40s all the way into the 70s, and then a number of the authors of the 80s, Gibson and others. David Brin really influenced me a lot too. But then I also read a lot of non-genre works. Cormac McCarthy was a big influence. Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is essentially a ghost story, if you want to cut to the heart of it, is one of my favorites. And a number of others. So, but in comic books, don't want to neglect comic books because I really grew up on comic books of the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
How about I remember when I was a kid in New York, the candy shops would often have magazine racks filled with like Asimov's science fiction. I remember there was a Twilight Zone magazine, science fiction, where I remember reading my first Stephen King story. Did you have similar kind of shops where every month the magazines would come out and you or your friends would wait for the various editions?
I can't say my friends would. I was probably the only one I knew who was reading science fiction and fantasy and comic books at the time. I did grow up in a rural part of Alabama, so it was kind of like unique to say the least. My grandfather received Asimov's and he subscribed to it. I still have some of the issues with his mailing label on it. But I do, yes, I remember very, very, very clearly the magazines that would show up every month. They were everywhere back then, so not so much now, but there's other benefits. You find a lot of the stories online. There's, in some ways it's easier to find them now.
Um, I know that, as you said, there's a lot of stuff online, and I know Project Gutenberg has a lot of the classic writing, even sci-fi writing from the early part of the 20th century. Um, how do you track, in your own lifetime, the evolution of sci-fi writing? And do you find yourself more influenced by the classic era mid 20th century writers who tended to write, at least in the public perception, these space operas versus a lot of the more modern writers that you might see at a Barnes and Noble or a half price books, which seem to be more of this foreign planets and dragons, that the dragons of such and such. Do you Are you more drawn to a mixture of sci-fi and fantasy, or are you more of a hard sci-fi person?
Well, I like all types of it. I'm drawn to really compelling storytelling. Like I said, I grew up on Clark, Asimov's, and some Heinlein. But as I grew older, the authors I appreciated were like Harlan Ellison. I hate the term literary, but writers who were taking the genre into new depths with their writing. So it wasn't just I mean, let's be honest. The golden age of science fiction has a lot of great stories, but for the most part, a lot of the writing then was just okay. The new wave movement of the '60s and '70s is really what clicked with me. The stories that were coming out then, Le Guin, Ellison, and so many others. Samuel Delaney. Oh my goodness, Delaney is one of my favorite authors. So those are the genre writers who really heavily influenced me. Again, I did grow up on Clark and everything, but those were the writers I read at a very young age, and then I discovered the new wave movement of the '60s and '70s, and then Gibson and others in the '80s.
I know some people that talk about things like steampunk and whatnot. It seems that most genre writing, and not just sci-fi, but other genres like horror and whatnot, have seemed to broken down into a lot of subgenres and whatnot. What do you consider your work to be, or do you hop around between subgenres?
Oh, I look for more of there's a movement in fantasy called the New Weird, which I really do love reading it. Jeff Vandermeer um, is a great example. His Southern Reach trilogy came out recently, and is a great example of it. Anne Vandermeer and Jeff Vandermeer also edited a great anthology called on the New Weird, which I do recommend people search out. But I don't write as much fantasy. I do write more science fiction. So what I kind of write seems to be a mix of it would fit in with the new weird if it was science fiction. If you know what I'm saying. In some ways, there are a lot of science fiction writers who are writing more of the weird science fiction stories. But that's kind of where I fit in, I think, and it's kind of a unique place right now. So
One of the perils that I think with science fiction, and certainly with some of the earlier authors that you mentioned, is that science eventually trumps a lot of the science fiction. For example, as we are recording here in 2015, if you had written a story based on Pluto, for example, 10 years ago, a lot of what we've discovered in the recent flyby of the spacecraft that give us information on Pluto would make a lot of the stories outdated. So do you tend to set your stories centuries or eons ahead of time, or do you do stories generally that are maybe just a few decades ahead of time?
I've done both. That is one of the traps of science fiction. Although a lot of the science fiction stories, the classic golden age stories, and even stories from the new wave, and all even the '80s and '90s, you can find where hey, that didn't turn out the way that people thought. But that doesn't take away from the fact that you can read the story and love them and appreciate them, even if there are some things like I don't know, in some of Heinlein's novels, you read especially Stranger in a Strange Land, some of the technology, he guessed at, you're like, wow, that totally missed the mark, but you can still, the novel can stand on its own without that. Now, but I do try, there's a difference between what you call the hard science fiction, where it is very technologically driven. And in some ways, the technology is almost as, or even more important than the characters. I do write some hard science fiction, but I never forget the characters. So, even the technology changes, as long as you focus on the characters and the story and how they're reacting to technology, I think the story will stand up. If you write a hard science fiction story that is totally about the technology, yes. If you don't have the characters and the story tied in with that work, then yeah, once the technology changes, you've got nothing. I try to think that my stories don't fall into that trap, but I'd have to leave that to others to say.
So, do you write, have you written stories, or when you read stories, say, that have non-human characters, um, do you try to get as much outside of not only yourself as an individual, but as a human being? For example, if we think of like the 1960s, the classic Star Trek, and even most of the Star Trek or Star Wars franchises, most of the aliens that you deal with are humanoid, rather
Right.
than if you look at a book like I think Stanislav Lem's Solaris, which the ocean-wide planet as a living being, or some other works that might have. I think there was a famous, it might have been Bradbury, about a cloud, an interstellar cloud of. Maybe it wasn't Bradbury. You would probably know that was a living cloud floating between the stars. Do you find, or what kind of, when you, if you do write about alien beings or whatnot, which are you more drawn to? Do you want to get more outside, or is it whatever serves the narrative of the moment, or do you find humanoid characters more easy to say, like with Rod Serling? All he said, it's easier to have a Martian say something that a Republican or a Democrat couldn't.
Honestly, I don't think I've ever written a story with an alien. I don't. My interest in science fiction and fantasy tends to be more on human topics. I do. I have read some great stories that have focused on aliens. But to be honest, most of the time, I find the aliens in in genre literature to be mere derivatives of humanity. Part of the problem is it's almost impossible for humans to imagine a truly alien life form and then to create it in fiction. But with my own writing, like I said, I don't. I'm trying to think. I don't. Okay, yes, I have written a few aliens, but even when I've written aliens, the story was focused on the human point of view of the interaction. So yeah, I mean, I can't really answer it because I
Yeah.
don't really go there. I'm more interested in the science fiction, what it says about the current human condition.
I remember some years back you had sent me a story, I believe, about, was it a mining operation on a planet that had a very weird orbit, that it took many years to go around its sun, and
Yes.
yeah, and was that part of a series? Have you continued that? I remember at the time you said it was going to be a series.
Right, that's Sublimation Angels. It actually was a finalist for the Nebula Award. Um, I have not. I did play with continuing it, but in the end, I didn't. I moved on to other projects. So maybe someday I'll go back to it. But
So what now is your current main focus within the genre? Are you doing mostly short stories? You had mentioned earlier a novel, and what are you going to explore in these future projects?
I've been last few years. I've been mainly publishing short stories. But I've started a new novel. I did finish a novel last year, which was a continuation of a series of stories I'd written that were published in Interzone called the Plague Bird series. People really liked those stories, and so I turned them into a whole novel. It didn't work as well as I wanted, so I will try to clean that up in the future. But right now, I'm working on a new novel. I'm about 20,000 words into it, chapter 7 or so. It's going very well. It is science fiction, far future. Somewhat, without giving too much away, if you read a lot of my stories set in the far future, you may start noticing they seem to be in a similar universe, which they are. They're in the same place, just different times. This one deals with a technologically based religion, and also, but it's you can read a lot about some current events going on in the world right now. I'm quite excited about it. I think people are going to like it.
Yeah, I know that one of the things when I've written fiction, well, like now I'm ending up a Western, and it's part of a trilogy that's going to be a genre Western. It's going to be a Western, a spy book, and then ending with a science fiction novel set in the future. And I'm going to have descendant characters in it. And I know one of the things with any genre is, in order to be considered genre, you have to do a certain amount of things to have it considered genre. But on the other hand, that you don't want it to become a work of hackery, you have to also expand. So in the science fiction realm, what things are the most reoccurring elements in your work, and what are the things that you look to sort of take that leap beyond, as John Keats called it, negative capability, something that seems odd at first reading, but if someone went back and read the story, they go, ah, okay, this is science fiction, but he did that too.
Right. Um, I mean, there are absolutely recurring elements in my fiction. Let me think on that for a second. As for science fiction, I mean, you can see in the tropes. I mean, if you watch any science fiction film or TV show, you will see the tropes. Those are the things that become, spaceships and faster than light travel, and popping from one planet to the next in time for the next episode or chapter. Those are common things that are so stereotypical now in science fiction. But I do see. I think one of the reasons I love the science fiction genre is there's so much potential to expand beyond the tropes. Now, that's true in any type of writing. I mean, you can get your, poetry can span the realm from the most cliched, hacked piece of drivel all the way up to something that's just totally unique and never seen before. Science fiction is like that, and that's one reason you're seeing a lot of the. And again, I hate the term literary, but a lot of the top literary authors now dip and dabble into genre fiction because they've realized they have so much freedom there to explore the human condition. Now, in my own writing, I think they're a reoccurring element. I'm always fascinated how people adjust to technological change, and yet still try to remain the core of who they are as a human. In some ways, and there's a lot of theories on this, but it's impossible to separate humanity from technology. The first stone axe, the first stone pebble tools that humanity created millions of years ago helped create who we are, just as we created the tool. It's like a never-ending loop, and so it's been through the centuries and the millennia. Our tools, our technology, have created who we are, and we've also created the technology that in turn created who we are. So it's a never-ending loop. So I'm fascinated by that. So as technology changes, how do we make who we are as humans? How does that stay the same? How does it change? So that's always going to be a core element of my fiction. Information, the transfer and transmission of information, which is another core aspect of humanity, is another reoccurring theme in my fiction. Other than that, I'd have to think about it.
All right, well, let's take a little break. When we get back, we'll talk a little bit more about your writing career earlier on in your life and how you've evolved, and we'll do that in a moment. All right, 1, 2, 3, recording. Back with Jason Sanford. I want to talk a little bit about Jason's writing career. I first met Jason, I think it was in late 99 or early 00. A local Minneapolis arts news weekly called City Pages had done a feature on me, and a woman who was active in the art scene of the Twin Cities at the time, named Laura Winton, I think, had organized some kind of gathering a month or two afterwards where, I don't know, a handful of people came to speak. And I think Jason was on the panel. So I met Jason that way. He had come to my poetry group a few times. And at the time, I remember you were doing what would be called in this era creative fiction or literary fiction. And I guess you hadn't gone back to science fiction at the time. I remember you had a really good manuscript of short stories called Cold Pelts that I had read, which was more biographical. So let's talk about the early O's and your literary fiction, because you also founded a website called StorySouth for Southern writers too, which I think is mostly literary fiction as well. So let's talk a little bit about that era of your writing and life, and how you then transitioned back to writing sci-fi.
Sure. I remember. I don't remember what the name of the panel was. We had that panel discussion at that coffee house. Decent turnout, I thought.
Yeah.
At the time, I was working for a literary organization called Sassy the Right Place. I was a program director. I ran a reading series all over the Twin Cities. Poets and fiction writers, multiple places every month would come and read their works. It was good. I really enjoyed it, but I should say, my wife and I had moved to Minneapolis. We met. We were both Peace Corps volunteers, and so when we came back to the United States, we moved to Minneapolis. And then when I met you at the time, I was working for that literary organization. I was writing what would be termed more literary fiction at that time. You know, in some ways, stories. I mean, it's still in a similar style to what I write now, similar themes and everything. Has some success, published in places like the Mississippi Review, Beloit Fiction Journal, and such. I think I got a Minnesota State Arts grant at one point. But I got into writing that basically because I was told and kind of internalized that, if I wanted to explore serious subjects and stuff in my fiction, I shouldn't be writing that genre stuff. It's an old story that you kind of get told, oh, you need to do something serious with your fiction, and which I am with my science fiction, but I kind of said, oh, I need to write something. I need to get away from genre stuff, even though the genre, like I said, was what I grew up reading and loving and everything. A while after probably after I left Minneapolis, I realized, this is not the fiction I was writing was not working for me. I started getting back into writing genre fiction, and it clicked.
Well, let me just ask you for young writers out there. When you say it wasn't working, because this is a point that a lot of young writers, some people who just want to express themselves aren't really artists. They just have a need to express themselves. So when you say it wasn't working, are you saying it wasn't working that you didn't think that your writing was good enough, or are you saying that just emotionally you weren't there?
More emotionally wasn't there. I was satisfied with the stories, but they weren't what I wanted. They weren't clicking for me. For me. Like I said, I was getting them published and everything, but it was like, this is not the voice I was trying to create. Come in these stories wasn't what I wanted. And when I started getting into the science fiction again, it was returning to what I grew up loving. I realized, hey, this is it. This is it. I regret that I kind of wish I'd, not detoured like that, but it took me to a good place in the end. So what the hell?
So what was the first? Oh, well, what was the first story that when you made that decision to branch back to going into genre, sci-fi slash fantasy, whatever you want to call it? Because I remember you did write a story about a goblin, which of course would have to be considered a fantasy rather than sci-fi. I think it might have even been like a young adult book. What was the first work, and uh, did that? How did you propel you? Or was it a base that you jumped off from? Did you just sort of make a clean break? Like going cold turkey.
I don't think it was a clean break, but I do remember one. Let's see. First, I wrote some stories that didn't work. Any kind of anything you do, it takes a while. There were stories I wrote which I never did anything with. The first one that got published was a story called Rumspringa, which was a science fiction story. It was published in Intergalactic Medicine Show, a professional science fiction magazine. That was my first accepted one. I did have one that was published in Tales of the Unanticipated, a Minnesota-based science fiction magazine back when I lived there. So maybe I guess that would be more accurate. That was kind of a transitional story. Something it was about for aging kids who dream of Star Treks or something like that. It was definitely a transitional story between my two styles. But then I moved, had that story in Intergalactic Medicine Show. I, was writing a number of stories and they weren't really clicking. This time clicking with publishers in the United States. The Intergalactic Medicine Show took one, which was a big, exciting. But then I started I was like, well, why am I getting so many rejections? I guess my stories aren't working. So then I happened to read the British magazine Interzone. I found a copy of it, and I said, wow, these stories are like not the same as what I'm writing, but these stories fit very well with my view of what I'm trying to do. So I kept writing and started sending them some stories, and they went crazy for it. Interzone ended up, I want to say the first 2 years I published with Interzone, maybe 10 stories they published. This would be starting in about 2009, I want to say. And they, like I said, they've ended up publishing maybe 13 or so of my stories. including Sublimation Angels, which was nominated for the Nebula Award. I won the readers poll 3 times, so obviously readers were really enjoying my fiction. So that was really what clicked it when the editors of Interzone started publishing my stories, and I realized, hey, what I'm doing is working with other people besides myself. Because as a writer, you do want, one of the reasons you write, you want people to read your stuff.
So, you mentioned that you won several awards and have gotten published. How is it then that certain writers, for example, if you go into bookstores, maybe if they're just churning out pulp stuff, can get published? So like Tor Publishers, I think, is one of the big publishers. I believe in that. And yet I know it's been difficult for you to even get these traditional publishers to publish like a collection of your short stories. You did have short stories that was published, I think, on an ebook, but
a small press published my a couple of years ago published my collection too. I originally self-published a short story collection, then a small press published it in a print edition. Well, for short story collections, they're a hard sell in the market. They don't sell as much as novels do by an order of magnitude. So publishers and agents are very reluctant to do anything with short story collections. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, I love short stories, so I enjoy writing short stories, and like I said, I'm able to publish them in magazines and reach readers that way. But for publishing a collection, that's a little bit harder. Most of the market right now is just geared towards novel-length fiction.
Well, let's backtrack just a little bit, because in the early O's you started a website called storySouth, and you ran it, and I guess for about close to a decade before, I guess, letting other people run it. This was not science fiction. This was creative fiction, literary fiction, basically from Southern writers, or set in the South. And I think I even I think you even published a poem of mine or something of mine once in there. So let's talk about when did you start it? Why did you start it? How long did you run it, and why did you eventually move away from it?
Well, I mean, like I said, I do, even though I write science fiction and fantasy, I do identify very heavily with the Southern literary tradition of storytelling and fiction writing. I wanted to do more to promote that, and part of the problem was I didn't like the types of stories that were being published. I wanted to see it, reach through a much wider net, and so I ended up founded storySouth with a poet named Jake Adam York. He handled the poetry, I did the fiction. It was a totally online magazine, which I want to say we started that in 2001. So back then it was still a new thing. I mean, there weren't a lot of them there, and it was hard to get to be accepted by the quote literary establishment, although that's a very vague concept. But we did some great stuff. I thought. I ran it about 10 years. Also did a contest called the Million Writers Award to promote online fiction and online authors. And I thought it was very successful. We had works published in I think Best American Poetry and other reprint anthologies and all that kind of stuff. But at some point, it takes a lot of time to do editing like that. I loved working with the authors, but in the end of the day, I was like, okay, it's time to focus more on my fiction, and I just didn't have the time to do it. We found a great group over in of a new publisher and everything to run it, Terry Kennedy and everyone else, and they've continued to do it. I still help out some with the Million Writers Award, which they now run also. But essentially, they're running it, and it seems to be it's established itself as a high quality online literary magazine.
Have you given any thought to doing something similar now in the sci-fi genre, or are there so many online marketplaces that it would be superfluous?
I think that the second choice, obviously, is that there's so many great places to publish online genre fiction these days, and you don't even have to go with genre publications. New Yorker, they usually do an issue every year of genre fiction. A lot of it's really there's almost more places to publish short fiction now, short science fiction and fantasy than any time in the last 60, 70 years. Now, The downside of that is you can't make a living doing it. Back in the golden age of science fiction, if you were a short story writer and you published a story, you could get paid about equivalent to what you get paid now. But back then, with if you got paid $500 for a story back in the '50s, you could live on that for quite a while. Now, not so much. So while there's more markets now and more opportunities to get your stories out there, it's harder for a writer to make a living at it. So I mean, what can you say about that? But no, I don't. I wouldn't be trying. It's too much work to do run a magazine, and like I said, right now I'm focused on my fiction. And plus, I gotta be honest. I started storySouth because I was really kind of disgusted by the lack of what stories that were good stories that I wanted to see published out there. And I don't see that with the in the genre community right now. There's some great places, Lightspeed Magazine, Clark's World. Those are two examples. Beyond Ceaseless Skies, those three are online magazines that publish excellent fiction. Then you have Interzone, Asimov, also doing excellent fiction. There's so many options. I don't see a need to try to do something to compete.
I know a few months ago when I had you on talking about the Watchmen, and a month or so ago I had the fellow who actually founded a thing called Sequart or Sequart.org, an organization devoted to promoting comic books as an art form. So talk a little bit about your interest in comic books and how that might intersect with sci-fi. And do science fiction writers such as yourself, you go to Comic-Con, or if you go to something like that or sci-fi conventions, is there something besides the Star Trek, Star Wars comic books? Is there something for the literary aspect of science fiction?
Oh yeah. I mean, comic books are another medium that have just expanded in the last few decades, and you have all types of writers and artists getting into it because of the potential of the genre, potential that is really being met. It's exciting times for graphic novels and comics. There's a great crossover between the science fiction fantasy communities, the comic book and graphic novel communities, and then you have the crossover with the gaming communities, the horror communities. I mean, in some ways, it all comes together. You've always got your people who are going to write more, more well crafted, carefully written stories, and those, who are going to crank out something, like Marvel Comics cranks out, a new issue of, I don't know, Spider-Man, or multiple issues every month. Some of them are, some of them you read and you go, wow, this is really something. Some of them you read, okay, that was just cranked out. There's a place for all of it. There's quite a bit of crossover. I've gone to, there's a convention in Indianapolis called Gen Con. I've gone to a few times. It's got a writing and literary fiction track. It's a very good writing symposium. I highly recommend it for any writers who want to get into the genre community, because they have some great workshops and everything. But it's also massive. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of people that come for Gen Con, mainly for the gaming and the comics and all that. So, yeah, there's a lot of crossover, and that's one thing that makes it exciting. I think, what we call literary fiction, I think is really boxed itself into something more narrow than what's out there in our culture right now. And I think, a lot of the genre communities, the science fiction, fantasy, the horror, the comic books, and all that, they're tapping into something that literary fiction wishes they could. And that's why you see so many, quote, literary writers dipping into those art forms.
Let's talk about e-publishing for a minute. And by e-publishing, I don't mean just online websites like storySouth or Cosmoetica or any of that. I'm talking about those things that you can read on a Kindle or a Nook. I know that a friend of mine who's on the e-list, and you probably interact with him, Alex Sheramet, released a book of criticism about Woody Allen's films through an e-publisher, and he's gone on a number of podcasts and radio shows around the country promoting it, and he's gotten some pretty good press. I think he's sold probably a few hundred, if not maybe a couple of thousand copies. With the e-publishing, where do you see that in the future? Because it would seem to me that if any genre was to embrace e-publishing just by philosophical disposition, it should be science fiction.
Absolutely.
So talk about that for a bit.
Sure. I mean, probably 99% 9/10 of the books I read these days are on I have an Android pad, but I use the Kindle app just because it's easy to use. But I've also used other e-reading platforms. It's easy, and I do most of the if I want a new book, and I don't buy them in print anymore. I think that I believe readership is really booming because of that. I mean, I know people are saying it's the death of books and all that. That's bullshit. It's easier now to get quality fiction and nonfiction than any time in human history. I mean, I can tell you, I grew up in Alabama, and I used to go and haunt the few bookstores we had in the city near me, Montgomery, and I'd go there, and they'd have a science fiction section, tiny, very tiny, and so I'd look at every single book there. And I'd go there maybe once or twice a week looking for new books and everything. I'd hunt the used bookstores trying to find stuff. I found enough to read, obviously. Like I said, my grandfather had a great collection of science fiction books. But it was nothing compared to. I remember going once to Atlanta to a bookstore there and going, oh, shit, it's a whole different level. And then when I was older, I remember going to New York and visiting some of the bookstores in New York. And my girlfriend at the time, I said, look, I want to see some of these New York bookstores. And she took me. And it was like, my mind was blown. I was like, damn it, I wish I had something like this growing up. Now, with electronic publishing, everyone has access to that. And that's a great thing. So there's no going back, and there shouldn't be any going back. And I think science fiction fantasy has really embraced that. I mean, I think most authors understand that, the majority of their sales now come from e-publishing. Even I just had a story that was published in Asimov's this month in the September issue. I just left the newsstands, I think, a week or so ago. But you could also buy, you could buy the issue on, Amazon Kindle or any of the ebook platforms. And I think I know their sales have climbed because of people can find them on so many different places.
Let me talk about. Let me throw this out. My guess is that I think with time, a lot of the people who reject e-publishing are going to obviously die off. But I've got a feeling that the thing that's going to be the tipping point is when someone who is a total unknown, not an already established quantity from the old media, but someone, Joe Bob Brown or Susie Lou Harper or whatnot, comes along, has her own website. She publishes a book on Amazon. It's of real quality. And then it not only sells a lot on Amazon, but makes it into the mainstream bestseller list. And then some Hollywood mogul says, we're going to give Susie Lou a chance here. And she becomes the next, Harry Potter, maybe more adult, but bestseller. And I think it's going to take that kind of cultural acceptance for ebooks to come along. My question is, do you agree with that model? And do you think, do you know of any science fiction writers, for example, who might be this generation's or this century's Asimov or Heinlein or Bradbury?
Well, one, I think we've already seen the situation. We've seen multiple cases of what you just described. Andy Weir, the author of The Martian, self-published that book himself. And then when it sold so well that he was picked up by a major publisher, then Hollywood's now turned it into a major movie with Matt Damon that's coming out, I think, this month, if I'm not mistaken. But that's one, he self-published that, and then, boom, went crazy, got the attention of a publisher, and there it is. And, just exactly what you described. It's happened already multiple times. There's a lot of genre authors who only self-publish, and they sell hundreds of thousands of copies. So I don't. There's another one, Larry Correia, who writes the Monster Hunter Incorporated series. He self-published originally, sold well, got picked up by a publisher, and again, now he's one of the larger genre authors in science fiction and fantasy. So we've already seen it happening. The downside, though, is you have to have a lot of time to self-promote then, unless you get lucky and it just clicks if you're self-publishing. Authors, have always had to promote themselves to one degree or another. And even if you're published by a traditional publisher, you still have to promote your works if you want them to, to find audiences and everything. But it's taken to self-publishing is you can't neglect that part of it. And some authors just don't want to do that or don't have the time. I know I have a full-time job. I have a young family. There's limits to how much time I have. I've self-published some of my short story collection, some other works. But it comes down for me is, okay, how much time am I going to spend on self-promoting and social media and all that to to get people to read this stuff, or writing the new story? And so far, I usually choose the writing the new story. But that's something, obviously, if every author is different. There's a lot of options now out there, I guess I could say. So that's the good thing is 30 years ago, you had one option. Now, there's multiple options. There's multiple ways you can go, and that's not a bad thing.
You mentioned certain outlets, both online and off science fiction. Let's talk about people that are now currently writing or publishing, whether they are self-published or not.
Okay.
People, let's say your age or younger, who do you like if you are looking through the latest edition of a magazine? Name maybe two or three authors that you're always going to read their story, and why, and what separates their work from the rest of the pack.
Well, one of the authors I always read is Ken Liu. Um, he's an amazing author. His first novel came out this year, but his short fiction is what I grew up loving. I just I can't I, words fail me on how good his short fiction is. I really enjoyed his novel too, and I look forward to reading more of his works. Aliette de Bodard is another science fiction fantasy writer I'll always read. Again, a great short fiction writer. I just finished one of her novels, excellent. I'm assuming you're talking about newer writers. So,
Yeah.
um, Paulo Bacigalupi wrote the novel The Wind-Up Girl, which won swept all the major awards in the genre. I've got his new novel, which I've got to read, The Water Knife. I've always loved his short fiction. Unfortunately, he doesn't write as much short fiction anymore. And then, those are just a couple, but there's a lot more out there. I mean, there's so many authors out there doing exciting stuff. And one thing is, we're now starting to see some translations of science fiction and fantasy from other countries. It was always a hard sell in the United States. Publishers, it was almost a catch-22. Publishers said that there was no market for translated fiction, science fiction, and fantasy in this country, so they wouldn't translate any science fiction and fantasy from other countries, so that there was no way for people to prove whether or not there was a market here. But we now saw a novel, the Three Body Problem, Chinese novel, recently won the Hugo Awards. Excellent science fiction novel. It was translated. Actually, Ken Liu translated. It's exciting times. There's a lot of great stuff out there, and those are barely. I haven't even scratched how many excellent science fiction writers there are out there. N.K. Jemisin is an author I always read. There's so many more out there. I can't even. I could go on and on. I don't want. I'm trying not to do that.
Well, let's sort of have you play the seer a bit, because you know certainly of science fiction over the last few centuries. Going back even pre-Verne and pre-Wells through, obviously those two are the sort of the twin titans of 19th century European sci-fi, and then through, as you mentioned, some of the masters of the 20th century. So we're recording this in 2015. If you can scope out, say, the rest of your lifetime, where do you think in the middle part of this century sci-fi might be, if you extrapolate from current trends? And again, do you think perhaps that scientific accomplishment in real life, such as the possible, I did a show on Ray Kurzweil, a debate, two people debating the worth of Ray Kurzweil a few weeks ago. Imagine if we do get artificial intelligence. Again, how do you think the real world will influence science fiction coming in the future?
Oh, I mean, it's all somewhere we live in the science fiction world. I mean, and and we always have. Like I said earlier, you know, technology created humanity, even as humanity created technology. Um, it's hard to. I mean, obviously, if anyone could predict the future, they would do it, and you know, they'd be vastly wealthy or powerful or whatnot. Um, so I can merely guess, but I see it. I think technology is going to become more in the background. I mean, it's going to be. How should I put this? You know, like no one really thought much about using hey you could make a sword back in the thousands of years ago. Hey, you just go and buy the sword. You know, you didn't think about how hard it was to realize to metallurgy and all of that, how long and how difficult it was for humanity to create it. At some point, it really became a part of human culture and the human condition, and you just accepted that if you had the money or the ability to do it, you could create a sword or you could create a plow. So in some ways, our technology is going to become like that. Um, it's going to people are going to stop being so wow. Look what my phone could do. I mean, there information. You need to. I guess my point I'm trying to get at is to understand where technology is going. You need to look at what humans desire and want. We want to have information. We are informational creatures. We want to always be able to any information we want. We want to have access to. So if you have technology that can help speed the access to information, to be there. We want to be able to kind of do what we want. We want to be able to follow our own dreams in life. So if there's technology that can help you do that, it'll do it. I think we're going to see a lot more, obviously, biotech technologies. You're going to see a lot more technology that's tied in with, genetics and manipulation of the human body. I mean, but in some ways, I maybe I'm an optimist. I don't see all that really truly changing what it means to be human. Um, there will obviously be changes in how we act and how we treat each other in the world and all that. But come down to it, I mean, we'll just have to see. But I think it will not change greatly what it means to be human.
All right, let's end this segment, and when we get back, we'll talk about a couple of other things and then round out the interview and give Jason closing remarks, and we'll do that in a moment. All right, I want to wrap up this interview just before I give Jason a few closing remarks. Just wanted to touch on a couple of other things. Before I get into his own future, I just wanted to touch on sort of what I consider the over commercialization, not only in film, but in publishing of what we call branding or franchising, whether it's Harry Potter or the millions of knockoffs, or whether it's the Avengers or the Marvel universe kind of thing. And do you think that it's harder for someone with an original idea to get something out there, whether in publishing or in any other areas that sci-fi touches? And do you think that the whole branding franchise thing is going to run its course in the next decade or so?
Okay, I, with the franchises, I do know they sell better. I mean, that's why everyone does them. Is if you have a series, it sells better than the standalone work because people they find comfort in something they've enjoyed before. So oh, I really like that story. Hey, there's a new one out, new sequel. Let me read that. Or it's the third Amazing Spider-Man novel film. Oh yeah, I enjoyed the first two. Let me go see that one. The so yeah, I mean, they're going to keep doing that. I mean, until people get tired of it. But in some ways, those franchises they resonate. I mean, that's why they sell. So I don't know if they're going to. I question whether they'll die out at any time. I mean, it's like if you go back into human history, there are certain stories that were told over and over and over again, and people didn't tire of those stories. They knew them. They heard new versions of them. Fairy tales or legends, all of whatever you want to call them. They didn't die out. They merely changed. Eventually, yes, everything dies out, but I think those franchises are going to do well for many, many years to come. Now, does that make it hard to publish something original? Yes, absolutely. But there's always going to be a way to do this. There's always a market, and there's always a story that will click with people and become the new a new series or a new franchise or a standalone story. You never know. So yes and no, I guess, is the answer.
We were recording in 2015. If you could, you know, put yourself ahead 5 or 10 years, where would you want to be in your own writing career? And is that something that you think you can graph, or maybe 3 or 4 years down the line, do you think maybe something unexpected will come up and might shift you in another direction, either within sci-fi or perhaps out of it again?
I don't see myself shifting out of it. I see myself. I'm gonna publish some novels. I've got several. Like I said, I've got several I'm working on. I've got a new one. Um, I'm taking a very disciplined approach to this novel. I think, and it's working very well. I mean, part of the problem was you know, as a writer, you have to grow, and now I'm actually have some novel length fiction that's working. So yeah, I expect to have several novels out. Um, you know, how well they're received and all that kind of stuff. I can just give the best shot I can. I got to tell a story that I want to tell, and hope that others like it. I'm gonna keep writing the stories. And how it ends up going with other than that, I know I'll find a way to get them out to people, and I know there will be people out there who will enjoy them.
Well, for viewers who enjoyed this interview with Jason Sanford, you can look below here the video, and you'll see a link to jasonsanford.com, his website that you can go to find out more about him. But let me give Jason a few minutes to just talk about anything he wants to regarding his own science fiction in general, where it's going, or whatever he wants to talk about. So, Jason, if you want to give a little closing monologue.
Yeah. I think we're talking a lot about science fiction and fantasy, but especially, I think sometimes people who don't read in the genre sometimes get, feel like it's hard to get into. I've had people tell me, "Oh, I love reading fiction, but I just can't get into science fiction," and part of that's because a lot of it can be very exclusionary. You have to kind of grow up knowing the tropes and all that kind of stuff. I like to think my stories, though, are something that people can enjoy. Even if you don't like science fiction and fantasy, give it a shot. You might enjoy them. Um, I appreciate talking with you. I've always, that's one thing that writing can be quite a lonely little endeavor, and I enjoy talking to people about this stuff. If you see me at a convention, I do go to a few conventions every year. If you see me there, come up, please talk to me. I do enjoy talking to people. Um, I don't know. Got nothing else than that. I'm just going to keep writing and keep trying.
So when you just let me just ask, when you go to conventions, do you mean that you have your own booth, or you just go there as a visitor?
Sometimes I go as some of them I'm a visiting author, some of them I'm officially there as
Okay.
a panelist and an author. Some of them I just go and I'm just taking part in the convention.
Okay.
Um, there's a convention. Probably I'll try to go to the World Science Fiction Convention next year, the World Fantasy Convention, which will actually be here in Ohio, so that will be convenient for me. It'll be here next year. I'll be at those two if everything goes well.
Okay, well, anyone else, as I said, wanting to find out more about Jason and his writing and his career, jasonsanford.com is his website. There is a link below this video. You can just click it to go there. I want to thank Jason for appearing. If you did enjoy this interview, though, tomorrow I will be interviewing 3 people about the life and career of American poet James Emanuel, who died not long ago, just a couple of years ago. And so that'll be my literature weekend completed. So again, Jason, thank you for your time.